Hi, everyone. Welcome to the special conversation with Scott Horton, one of the most respected independent voices in foreign policy analysis. Through his work as a broadcaster, author, and founder of the Libertarian Institute, Scott has spent decades examining international conflicts, government policy, and the often overlooked realities behind global headlines. In this discussion, we'll explore the current state of world affairs, the lessons of past conflicts, the challenges facing independent journalism, and what a more peaceful future might look like in an increasingly complex geopolitical environment. From the legacy of our modern wars to the changing balance of global power, Scott brings a wealth of knowledge and a unique perspective on the issues shaping our world today. Scott, thank you for joining us. How are you, Scott?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much for having me on.
You're most welcome. Scott, you spent decades analyzing US foreign policy. Looking at today's geopolitical landscape, what do you believe is the single greatest misconception the public has about how foreign policy decisions are actually made?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I think this goes for not just foreign policy, but really all government policy. Is the mistaken idea is that the government is acting in the interests of the country at large, rather than zooming in a little bit and seeing that it's just the people in the positions of responsibility making decisions that primarily they think are good for themselves and may or may not be good for the people at large. And then of course there's the corruption of the lobbies, where I think people kind of have an inkling of this. Overall, we don't really know what to do about it. But the so-called special interests, they decide policy, and the people have no say, really. So the special interests can even include, for example, foreign countries like Israel, who have an endless amount of money that they get from us in the first place, and then recycle a small part of that back into lobbying our government, lobbying our media, um, exercising their control through think tanks and magazines and newspaper editorial pages and everything that they can think of to do to push their way. And then there's no one really there to push back against it. And so you have essentially the levers of power are gigantic in an empire. So then it takes massive forces to be able to move them, right? So the people of Kansas, whatever they think, doesn't really have any weight compared to the corporate boardrooms at Lockheed and Boeing, or the foreign ministry over in Israel, where they will, put in their weight to decide what the policy should be so they can have things their way. Whereas the idea that somewhere in the White House they're saying, yes, but this will cost the American people money and we can't have that, or like that doesn't come into it, right? We are essentially here to be used for their goals rather than being actually protected by their so-called security forces.
In your book, Errand, you examine the war in Afghanistan in great detail. What lessons from that conflict remain unlearned by policymakers today?
Well, so there are some that are particular to Afghanistan and some that, are particular to fighting what they call counterinsurgency warfare, or what the British called counter-revolutionary warfare against, locals, essentially Minutemen, resisting occupation. On the broader level is the question of just what the American government and its military forces can accomplish through just money and willpower, and what they can't. You could say that, well, they suck at counterinsurgency, but why do they suck at counterinsurgency? Because the whole plan in the first place doesn't make any sense, and they don't understand that, and they try it anyway. I mean, to really boil it down, like, this is not really oversimplifying it. This is the bottom line of counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, okay? Is we have to make these poor Pashtun peasants down in the Helmand province, we have to make the women folk prefer our Marines to be their security force instead of their own husbands and fathers and brothers and uncles. They're supposed to believe us that their own kin are their enemy. And we are actually the good guys here to protect them from those bad, bad men, the Taliban, when that's just their family members attempting to provide security in their local region. Okay, you see how completely stupid that is? You see how that could never work in a million years. And yet, they spent the whole year of 2009 selling it in Washington, D.C. This is not counter-revolutionary warfare. This is COIN, the new rewritten counterinsurgency manual by David Petraeus and General James Mattis. And these guys, why they can do so many push-ups and they're so smart and they can do anything, including convince the women folk of the Helmand province to side with the Marines against their own husbands and fathers. You just watch them. They can do it. And then they failed. They lost the war. It didn't work. But that was how, like, you could call it Jonestown cult levels of suspended disbelief, right? Like, I could go and watch The Empire Strikes Back and believe in Chewbacca, right? I'm not seeing an Englishman in a suit. I'm seeing a Wookiee saving the day. I believe in Chewbacca while I'm watching that movie. That's how Washington, D.C. is when they have a new foreign policy to accomplish. Oh, come on, guys. It's all going to work. In 2009, during Obama's big surge, when he tripled the war, gave them 70,000 more troops and escalated the war massively through 2012. They called the leaders, because they had renamed counter-revolutionary warfare, counterinsurgency warfare, and then they gave that a neat little, Pentagon name, COIN. So then the leaders and the promoters of COIN became known as the Coindinistas. Get it? Like they're communist revolutionaries in El Salvador or Nicaragua, whatever. Anyway, the Coindinistas, boy, they know what to do. They're such experts. They come from the top think tanks, and you have to trust them. You must believe in them. They're the experts. Why Michelle Flournoy and John Nagel and all of these guys who you never heard of before, trust us, dude. Watch. This guy wrote a book called Eating Soup with a Knife. And it's about how he's really smart and he knows what to do. Except that, of course, it's really difficult to eat soup with a knife, dude, right? Like you'd have to be a damned fool. The book is called I'm a Damned Fool by John Nagel. Why? Or I think that was the one who wrote that one. Anyway, and then the point being, none of these guys are impressive people at all. None of them have an IQ north of 105. None of them know the first thing about Afghanistan. None of them are even willing to break it down and tell you what I just told you. That, our theory really here is that we're going to separate the civilians from the fighters when the fighters are civilians. And so that doesn't make any goddamn sense, right? They can't do that. All they can say is, give us more troops. We'll make it happen. And after all, in their mind's eye, they got the 12-foot tall, big green military machine. And what do the Taliban got? They don't even have sandals. They got nothing. How could they resist us? But the answer is because it's their country, not ours. As they always said, you have the watches, but we have the time. And so America lost that war. And then instead of saying, oh my God, we suck at this. What are we doing? We should stop having wars for 50 years until we figure out what the hell is going on around here. You know what they did? 3 months later, they pivoted to war in Ukraine. And they had every opportunity to negotiate a peaceful resolution to that thing, but they refused because I think they did sincerely try to warn Putin, you better not. But they didn't really care if he did. And they actually thought that it would be funny if he did and that they would help inflict a strategic defeat on Russia if they did. There's a interview with Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is Jimmy Carter's foreign policy, national security advisor in the Jimmy Carter years. And he gave an interview to a French newspaper in 1996 where they asked him, is it true that you deliberately provoked Russia into invading Afghanistan? And he says, well, we didn't deliberately provoke them into invading Afghanistan, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. Well, that's the same thing. Yeah. We deliberately poured in money to the Mujahideen to make the Soviet Union feel like they better invade now before it gets worse. And then they did. Okay. Same thing here in Ukraine. Oh, we're not provoking them into invading, but we're knowingly increasing the probability that they will. And then they laughed about it. And they said over and over again, just put it in your, Google news search and limit your time frame to the first half of 2022 and look for the terms Ukraine and strategic defeat. And you'll see the Americans believing that they were going to so severely weaken Russia by essentially baiting them into this war and replicating not our failure in Afghanistan that just ended 3 months previously, but the Soviets' failure in Afghanistan that we helped inflict on them in the 1980s. And they even fantasized, many of them, that it would lead to the fall of the Putin government and a full regime change and a new pro-American government rising in the Kremlin after their humiliating total destruction and defeat in the war in Ukraine, which did not happen, right? And the Russians have taken more and more territory since then, slowly, but still. And then so on it goes, right? And, I kind of, I don't know if this comes from reading a novel when I was younger, or like maybe even just maybe reading like nonfiction books that has a quotes of a lot of powerful like principal type agents in it. But I kind of have this daydream of after working hours and most of the staff goes home and the sun goes down and these people are having a few drinks. Maybe they turn the lights down a little bit and they're having a few drinks. Don't they ever say to themselves that, well, like this terrible problem is kind of our fault. And since we did sort of play a negative role in the thing, maybe we could find some room to compromise. No, they never do. They never do. That whole thing about with wine comes honesty, vim veritas, not in the White House. They never admit the truth, not to each other, that like, boy, man, we really should not have done this. And we better figure out a way to undo what we've done. In fact, I think Donald Trump trying to seek peace with Iran right now, if in fact that's what he's doing, I think he is. That's not entirely certain, but that's like the closest thing we've seen to a president recognizing he made a bad bet and calling it quits. And I think, the military, they just told him back in April, listen, we're running out of interceptors. We can't keep this up. They have more missiles and drones than we can shoot them down. And so we got to stop. And then they did their blockade and the blockade on the blockade and all those things. And then they realized our economy and the rest of the world's economy cannot sustain this. We have to give in. And he said, okay, fine. What does he care? He could just flip on a dime and, go from demanding unconditional surrender to surrendering unconditionally. And he doesn't care. Thank God he doesn't care. And he's willing to just flip on a dime and give in like this. But what would Barack Obama do? Barack Obama would curl up in a ball at the feet of Lindsey Graham and order a bigger escalation. And so I think Trump is at least willing to concede to reality after he fails in what he should not have tried.
Many governments justify military interventions in the name of security. How can ordinary citizens distinguish between genuine national security concerns and policies driven by political or strategic interests?
Look, America is an empire. We start all these wars. None of them are defensive. They have to tell us that when we attack Iraq, when we invade Iraq, they told us it's a preemptive war. Oh, yeah, because Saddam Hussein was about to give an atom bomb to Osama bin Laden, and we're preempting that attack by invading first. You see how that's a giant load of crap? They were lying, and they knew they were lying, and they're always lying. They pretended to believe that they were saving not America, but the people of Libya from Muammar Gaddafi, because he was going to rape them all to death if we didn't go and invade the country. The responsibility to protect. Why, not only has Gaddafi sworn, not true, that he's going to kill every last man, woman, and child in Benghazi, he's giving out Viagra to all his soldiers to rape and then murder every woman and girl that they find as they rampage across their country. Now, he's been the dictator for 45 years, and he's never done this before. But now, all of a sudden, apparently, he just wants to kill everyone in the eastern half of his country and rape all of their women and girls to death, too. We see how they're lying. You see how that's a giant load of crap. You see how the people who said that knew they were lying. That's completely stupid and preposterous. But they said it was true, so they'd have an excuse to launch an aggressive war, right? And they do it over and over again. Hell, even Afghanistan, they lied to the American people that it was the Taliban that had attacked us, when the Taliban was guilty of allowing al-Qaeda to live in their country, when they should have exiled their asses a long time ago. But they were not in on the plot. They, in fact, warned the United States and the United Nations about an impending al-Qaeda attack against the United States, and they didn't even learn about it from al-Qaeda telling them as friends. They learned about it from an informant that they had inside al-Qaeda that told them, I believe a Tajik, who told the Taliban, and then the Taliban immediately squealed on them. But the Americans ignored their warning. So they told the American people that we have to go to war not against Osama bin Laden and his couple of hundred friends hiding in the Nangarhar province on the Pakistani border. No, we have to go to war against the Taliban regime in Kabul. We have to hold them responsible for what bin Laden did. Oh, and look, bin Laden's getting away while we're busy taking over the capital city and installing a new government in power and declaring war against all of its enemies for the next generation. So even though, and really they could have negotiated after the attack, they still could have negotiated bin Laden's handover, but didn't. And then when they invaded, they let him go and took the war to the Taliban instead. So that war wasn't really any more honest than Iraq or Libya or Syria. You know, they invaded Somalia. They've been bombing Somalia since Bush invaded in December of 2001. It's America's longest war. We haven't stopped bombing them this whole time. Al-Shabaab didn't even exist until 07, after America in, 06, after America and Ethiopia invaded the country. Al-Shabaab then was the insurgency that rose up after, but Bush had been bombing them for 5 years before that. And they don't even bother lying about that one because no one heard and no one cares. If they were, well, I guess they do, because they say, oh, well, we're fighting Al-Shabaab. But they never admit that Al-Shabaab was the smallest and weakest part of the Islamic Courts Union until America sponsored the Ethiopian invasion. Then, yeah, guess who fights? The youth. That's what Al-Shabaab means, the boys. And so they were the ones who grabbed the rifles and went out to fight the invading force. No wonder. But anyway, so how can you tell if it's legit or not? It's never legit. America is the world empire. All of our wars are aggressive. Yes, they had the right to kill bin Laden after September 11th. That's the worst blowback we've suffered. We've had no nation states dare to attack the United States. They know we're armed to the teeth with H-bombs. They wouldn't dare. No nation in the world would dare attack us. The only people who would dare are stateless terrorists who don't mind dying anyway. And then most of the time, our government backs them, like in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Kosovo, Chechnya, and then since September 11th and in post-Iraq War II, back them in Libya, Syria, Iran, and Yemen against their Shiite enemies. And so most of the time, our government is actually on the side of the anti-American terrorists, the ones who have shed innocent American blood and the blood of American soldiers and other combatants. So there's no, in fact, really, it ought to be the other way, right? Like the question ought to be turned around. Why should anyone ever believe these lying murderers? Ever?
Effective. The world appears to be shifting from a unipolar to a more multipolar order. How do you see the rise of powers such as China influencing the future of international relations and global stability?
I'm sorry, I missed that. You say the world's getting more multipolar, and then what now?
No, I said the world appears to be shifting from from a unipolar to a more multipolar order. How do you see the rise of powers such as China influencing the future of international relations and global stability?
Mm. Well, that's a good question. I mean, I'm not really good at predicting a lot of stuff. My specialty is criticizing things that already happen. But I don't really know, but I think that overall, it's most likely that the hype about China and its threat is overblown. I think they'd be fools to try to build a world empire like America has built. You know, they may fly that commie red flag, but I think they understand that they're much better off simply buying the resources they need rather than trying to steal them. It just makes no sense, and especially when American leaders over the last 30 years have just about blown America's brains out trying to build this world empire. You know, it's in the premise of your question. We're shifting from a unipolar world to a multipolar one. Why? Because the Americans blew $40 trillion. Well, that's the national debt. They blew $20 trillion building a world empire. And supposedly we're all profiting from it, but no, we're not. It's all at the American people's expense. And it's all hugely counterproductive. And so now it's all falling apart because we can't afford it. Well, that goes to show you right there. It's not a profit-making enterprise. If it was a profit-making enterprise, we could afford it all day. We could afford it forever. We'd be making more and more money and compound interest on top of that. Instead, it's clearly a net loss for our society. And that's why we're being forced to give it up. Now, is it possible that the communists in Beijing are looking at America and they're going, yeah, that's what we should do, is blow our own brains out? We could, make some short-term gains for 20 years and then lose everything. Probably not. And, unlike the United States of America, China has 15 neighbors that they have to deal with. Some of them extremely powerful neighbors, or at least, relatively powerful neighbors like Japan and India. But 13 more besides. They got to have 15 foreign policies plus deal with America and Europe. And so, purchasing power parity and whatever, do they have the budget now to build up a military force that can threaten their neighbors? Yeah. I mean, they already have had not just atom bombs, but hydrogen bombs for decades. They have built essentially a world-class Navy, but I should say, really, I mean by that a first world Navy, but not world-class in the sense that it's built for, dominating the entire planet the way America's carrier battle groups are. They have built up a massive naval force enough to conquer Taiwan and keep us away. There's very little reason to believe that once they take Taiwan, they're going to go to Korea and Japan and Australia next. It would be extraordinarily costly. There are a lot of things, a lot of wealth in those places to steal. But probably on the balance sheet, and the communists in Beijing are pretty good capitalists when it comes to stuff like that. On the balance sheet, it just makes more sense for them to try to cooperate with the world than try to dominate it at gunpoint. Even the American empire has loudly proclaimed its benevolence this whole time, that really we're just trying to provide global security and not even at our own interests, but for your interests. In fact, it was persuasive in a way because, for example, one of the big trade-offs that the American government made was, as long as countries will allow them to have military bases in their country, then you can keep your tariffs on our goods, but we'll drop our tariffs on yours, which hugely disadvantages American firms and American workers. But Washington doesn't care. They get a military base and they get to dominate Germany and Korea and Japan's foreign policy. So that's the trade-off for them. That's what they get out of it. But then for Germany, Japan, and Korea, they're like, well, the American empire kind of sucks and they tell us what to do. But then again, they let us export all of our stuff to them with no tariffs on it or very low ones. And so made it seem worth it, at least, financially for them for a very long time and all that. But is China going to do that? No, they're not going to do that. So what do they get for trying to build military bases in Germany? What do they get for trying to dominate the Middle East when all that oil's for sale anyway? And they don't have any need to dominate Western Europe. They can just buy whatever the Germans manufacture rather than somehow, in some 100-year fantasy taking over that far Western Eurasian continent, or part of the continent. You know what I mean?
Yeah. As someone who has interviewed thousands of experts, diplomats, journalists, and scholars, what are some of the most surprising insights you've gained that really make it into mainstream discussions?
Oh, let's see. Directly from the interviews? Well, I'd have to think about that one, I guess. I don't know. I guess one thing that I learned long before the mass of the American public is that marginal writers tend to have their act together, the so-called alternative media, having a much greater incentive in being honest and really being very self-motivated in the first place, to be part of the media for principled reasons, did a hell of a lot better job on all of these issues over these decades than all of the so-called professionals and experts who essentially got everything wrong, and especially in the media, but all the think tankers and whatever. Many years ago now, rest in peace, Chalmers Johnson was a former professor at the University of Southern California in LA and was a contract analyst for the CIA, ardent Cold Warrior back in the old days. And he used to say, he said this, I'm pretty sure he said this to me on my radio show back years ago in the W. Bush years, that antiwar.com every day, that's what he does. He wakes up, he reads antiwar.com first thing every morning. And as he put it, it's better than the CIA's morning daily brief. And as he put it, how do I know? Because I used to write them. And he would say that he could get better intel about what's going on in the world by listening to my show and reading antiwar.com than if he was at the CIA. And for a lot of, institutional reasons, mostly, right? Because we really only care about the truth. And we have a vendetta against the war party, but we're right. So our bias serves us instead of working against us. And where I guess on the other side, they don't. They're so agenda driven that they tell, despite all their hype about being as unbiased as possible, when they deliver their so-called intelligence to their so-called customers in the White House every morning, it's essentially cooked to tell the president and his men what they want to hear. Mm-hmm. And so they're only getting kind of partial information. And it's also based a lot of times on secret information that they know that we don't know through wiretaps or through spies or whatever, that may very well be true, but doesn't really negate the overall knowledge to be gained from open sources on that same day. So you might have, some secret source telling you about something happening in Iraq or Iran or whatever, but it doesn't negate the overall wisdom that you would have got if you'd just been reading antiwar.com, because we have, we're working so hard to look at so many different things at the same time and to compile the truth for you in a way with an anti-institutional bias instead of a pro-war bias from inside the machine.
Independent journalism faces enormous challenges today, from financial pressures to information overload. What advice would you give to aspiring journalists who want to pursue truth without becoming trapped by political narrative?
Well, I mean, for me, I hate them. The government is your enemy. And You start with that and you'll be fine. I don't know. I'm a libertarian. I know there are a lot of anti-war people on the right who would like to see the government make society this way or that way instead. And a lot of anti-war people on the left who would like to see the government make society this way or that way instead. The thing I would like to change about society the most is government's role in making it one way or the other ever at all. I want them to really just leave us alone. And this sort of goes back to your previous question about foreign policy and how do you know you can trust them or not? You can't. Your security force is your enemy. Just think about on the basic level. Doesn't it make sense that the cops and the prosecutors and the judges let armed robbers go free while they keep pot salesmen and whatever other offenders locked up? Of course, it makes sense that they do that. If there's not criminals on the street, then what do we need them for? And if they were to round up and arrest and severely prosecute the 10th of 1% of the society in your town that is avowedly criminal, to the point where everybody else could just go about living their lives, they get their budget cut. You wouldn't even need so many judges and so many prosecutors. They'd have to go get real jobs. So they let the real criminals run free while they lock up offenders against state edicts. Because of course they do. So yeah, if that's your attitude, that your security force is your enemy and that you should never believe them because they're always lying, then you could be a pretty good journalist, probably.
Conflicts in regions such as the Middle East continue to shape global politics. What developments should people be paying closer attention to that are currently being overlooked?
Well, I think probably one of the most important things going on right now in the Middle East is all the developments in Syria with the rise of the new al-Qaeda regime there. The leader, they call him al-Shara. His former name was Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, and he fought under Abu Musab al-Zarqawi as part of al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003, thereabouts. And he even admitted to American government television, PBS Frontline, that he fought Americans and presumably killed some fighting in Mosul and Ramadi in Iraq War II. Now, American soldiers shouldn't have been in there in the first place, but whatever. This guy's sworn blood oath loyal to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi and Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. The fact that those three are dead doesn't change the fact that that makes him an enemy of the American people, and certainly no one to support. But, as I mentioned before, America supports al-Qaeda, particularly now, in the past against Serbs and against Russians and for various reasons, but particularly now fighting against Iran and their Shiite friends, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and of course the Assad government, which was, really led by the Alawites, which is sort of kind of a break-off group of the Shiites and very close to them and a treaty ally of Iran. And so because it's America last and Israel instead, and this is not just Donald Trump, this is the Joe Biden government. And, before him, Trump before, and before him, Barack Obama, they're on the side of al-Qaeda because al-Qaeda hates Hezbollah and Israel hates Hezbollah. So the enemy of Israel's enemy is my friend, even when they killed thousands of American civilians. And it's high treason, quite frankly. And there's Donald Trump, just like Joe Biden bragged about helping the Jolani, terrorist group sack Damascus at the end of 2024. Donald Trump calls him strong and brave and handsome. He goes, he has a strong past. A strong past? You mean killing American GIs in Mosul and Ramadi? A strong past? And then he goes, he's tall and strong and handsome, and he sprays perfume on him, flirting with him in the Oval Office. The guy who fought under Zarqawi in Iraq War II. And one of the first things that they did when they took over was launch massive pogroms against Alawites and Christians, slaughtering thousands of Alawites, kidnapping and raping their women, and God knows what. It's really no different than ISIS. Maybe it's one click more, politically sophisticated. It is ISIS. ISIS is Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That's all it is. That was Zarqawi's group in Iraq War II. And after he was killed in the summer of 2006, they named it the Islamic State of Iraq, telegraphing their intentions. Not that they had the ability to create an Islamic State, but saying exactly that was their intent, was to create an Islamic State. That was the group that came across the border from Iraq into Syria to start the revolution in 2011. And so when, there was the split between ISIS and Nusra, that was really just the Iraqi-dominated faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq in Syria, splitting from the Syrian-dominated faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq in Syria. And then what did ISIS do? They went east and conquered Western Iraq and created the caliphate, leading to Iraq War III and all of that. But then when Russia came to intervene and beat back the Al-Qaeda forces in the west of the country, they all eventually surrendered and fled to the Idlib province. And they were held up in the Idlib province from essentially like the end of Obama, first year of Trump won, through the end of 24. And then what happened at the end of 24 is really just like the October 7th attack, right? They broke out of their pen. Only in this case, they sacked the capital city. And in this case, instead of Hamas, it's Al-Qaeda. But we're supposed to be happy. We're supposed to be cheering because they're taking out the Alawites who are in bed with Iran. And that's what Israel wants. And so, I have in fact, you can see this book behind me here, Creative Chaos by William Van Wagenen. I published that book at the Libertarian Institute. And William Van Wagenen is a brilliant American expert who lived in Syria for a long time, has traveled there many times, and wrote this book about Obama's dirty war that led to the rise of the caliphate and all of this stuff in the first place. And I'm going to be interviewing him on my show later today to get the latest there.
You often advocate for a less interventionist foreign policy. What practical steps could world leaders take today that would meaningfully reduce international tensions and the risk of future wars?
Expand capitalism, expand trade, lower trade barriers. They have this democratic peace thing that says that democracies don't fight each other. But that's not what it is. And it's hardly an iron law of the universe the way they portray it, but it ain't democracy. It's capitalism, and it's free trade among nations that prevents violent conflict. So look, for example, at the Nord Stream pipeline, where Germany is buying natural gas from Russia and Russia is collecting euros from Germany in exchange. That is a massive counter incentive to conflict. They are making them economically interdependent on each other means that they have more reason to seek peaceful resolutions to their problems. But then, listen to the way the Americans portray that. They go, yeah, see, it's blackmail. That means Germany can never fight Russia now because Russia has them dependent on their natural gas. That's why we have to free Germany from these terrible constraints. No, man. Listen. The last 2 times that Germany and Russia fought, it was the worst thing that ever happened. Then they did it again. It was the worst thing that ever happened. So who cares if Texas natural gas companies lose out on a few measly stinking $1 billion when a peace pipeline between Germany and Russia is priceless? And that's what all of mankind ought to be encouraging, is more pipelines in all directions instead of this brutal kind of mercantilist 19th century imperial approach to making sure that no, the pipeline has to only run this way and not that way because we don't want that country to get their fees. We only want this country to profit, not them, and all of this stuff. This is the game that we've been playing through the old Cold War and into the new one. And I mentioned that America supported the terrorists in Chechnya. Why? To keep the Caucasus destabilized so that the Russians couldn't reopen an old Soviet pipeline through the Caucasus Mountains and take oil and natural gas out of the Caspian Basin and ship it north through Russia. And that was why instead they supported the terrorists there and then built the BTC pipeline that goes from Baku to Tbilisi to Jayan, Turkey on the Mediterranean Sea. The pipeline goes due west and cuts out Russia and cuts out Iran. But no, that's stupid and wrong. We should have built those pipelines to go through Russia and Iran. If we have tensions with Russia and Iran, what better way to solve that than to build pipelines with them, to make money with them? And that's not just some libertarian fantasy stuff. That was what Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was, again, national security advisor during Jimmy Carter, when Jimmy Carter lost Iran in the Iranian Revolution, the hostage crisis, all that was egg on Zbigniew Brzezinski's face. That was his humiliation. Well, by the beginning of the 1990s, he said, who cares? Water under the bridge. We got, business is business. What is he supposed to have emotions or something? Let's get down to business. Let's open some pipelines. In fact, see, he just wanted to screw the Russians by building a pipeline across Iran. So he was only half good on what I'm talking about here. But still, Alexander Haig also wanted to build a pipeline across Iran. Dick Cheney, CEO of Halliburton, former defense secretary, future vice president in the 1990s, wanted to do business with Iran and build pipelines across Iran to bring them in from the cold, to normalize relations with them and make a little bit of money and, yeah, screw the Russians. But still. So my point being is, instead of having all these rent-seeking special interests lobbying the empire to favor their needs at the expense of the American people and other people in the world, we should have a government that's so small that it doesn't have the ability to intervene over there. And if American companies want to do business in other countries, they're just going to have to deal with the business climate in those countries as is and not be able to rely on the American government to come and intervene on their behalf, and not rely on the American government to have a national economic policy of any kind, and to figure it out on the market. That's it. And that would be a great way to lead the world by example. Actually, practicing what we preach about independence and freedom. And with that, I'm sorry, because I have to go. I got another interview right now.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your time, Scott. Take care and God bless.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome.